And today we're really going to get into getting further into specifically classifying cancel culture and our discussion of Beauchamp's article, which was the homework that was due today. And of course, we're going to start off with voting for the paper 4 topic so that we can finalize that. You guys will know what to expect, and I can start planning our final unit since, of course, we're getting to the final countdown. We're week 10 already, so after this week, we only have 6 weeks left. So really over halfway done with the semester. And to begin with, which is not pulling up, we are going to do the poll for the paper 4 topic. Go to the activity. So for this, what you can do similar to last time is you can get your phone out and access the QR code, and that'll bring you to the poll. So I've set up the poll where you can answer 3 times. So essentially you want to choose the 3 topics you guys are most interested in, just so since there are a lot of different options we're going over, we can get the best consensus into the topic you want to focus on. So you can access that QR code and respond 3 times. Otherwise, you can text to 37607 or respond to the poll of. But our different options, as we talked about last week, we have gender roles, conspiracy theories, police enforcement and Black Lives Matter, political requirements for government representatives, popular vote versus the Electoral College, term limits for representatives, national aggression worldwide, protests versus riots, mandatory military service, social media, pedophilia as a gender, and cultural stereotypes. So you guys can respond 3 times. And then I'm not sure for role who is pineapple belongs on pizza. In terms of the name. That name's not on the roster. I'm a little disappointed it's not, but
is it too late to add? Do we have affirmative action on there?
I don't think pineapple belongs on pizza knows that that's their name on Zoom. That's pretty funny. Did everyone get the link okay? Okay, thank you, Artie. Yeah, you can be pineapple belongs on pizza, Artie. It just, you don't have to change it. You just need to know so you can get credit. It's pretty funny, and of course, talk about debatable topics. The pineapple on pizza debate is pretty strong. I'm a fan of pineapple on pizza, depending on what the other toppings are.
Where's the QR code?
Dan, question?
Yeah, for the QR code, you said we could use the QR code.
I can't hear you. Do you need the QR code?
You can hear me? Yeah.
Okay, let me bring that QR code back up again. Here you go. And if you guys came in late, if you haven't already, you were voting 3 times. So for the 3 different topics you guys are most interested in, just so we can get the best sense for the topic to cover for paper 4. Virginia, since you came in a little late, we're doing the vote for the paper 4 topic. So you can just use your phone to access the QR code, and you can vote 3 times for the topic you guys are most interested in. So the 3 different options. so interesting to see as it changes.
And then as it changes, it'll say the poll is full.
I think your mic's really muted. I don't know if it's your computer or mine, Dan.
No one else hear me? No? I don't know.
I can like faintly hear you. Huh, so other people able to access? Can you try again?
How about now?
Perfect. I have microphone issues when I try recording like lectures for my online class. So I think it just makes it wonky when I get to Zoom and I have to change a setting. So sorry about that. And then
Okay, I was like, it was working fine last class. I don't know what happened.
it's
Okay.
the ghost in my apartment. He's just always, you know, sabotaging me. So Virginia, we're able to access it. So you can either access it through the QR code or, well, actually it's muting it for some reason. Should still be allowing responses. I don't know why it's not. Huh. Oh, there we go. So Virginia, did you access it through the QR code we have right here? Did everyone else was able to access it okay? Okay. I don't know why it's saying the poll is full. I didn't set any restrictions. Gotta love technology. So unless, and it keeps changing. That was creepy. So it looks like our top two would be gender roles and conspiracy theories. So they're both at 20%. So in terms, now we have a runoff vote. Just like with a runoff election. So give me 1 second. Let me stop the screen share and I'm gonna do a Zoom poll. Where is that option? I thought I had it set up here. I guess not. That's super weird. Sorry, Monday morning tech issues. There's always going to be something that goes wrong. Okay, so now we're going to do our final one. So with one more time, so in this time you only are allowed to respond once. So you're just choosing between the two gender roles and conspiracy theories, which one you are most interested of those two options. So you can access the new QR code and that'll allow you to do the final poll. So we can finalize the choice for our final paper. Can you guys access this one okay?
Is it only supposed to show those two?
Yes. Since those were for the previous ones, they were tied for the first. So I just now created this one with just these two.
Okay.
So
It took me to the old one.
Yeah, I was gonna say when I
Yeah,
see
same
the
with
QR
mine.
code.
Interesting. Um, Let me try it again now. I don't know if it was separating it.
Mine's still going back to the old one.
Okay. So in that
Same.
case, I feel like technology is sabotaging me. So we'll just do the old fashioned, raising your hand with Zoom voting. So if you want to focus on gender roles, you can raise your hand or do the thumbs up right now.
Where is that again?
So if you go to reactions, so your actions, you can choose the different symbols. So you want to keep the thumbs up so I can complete counting while I was waiting for everybody. I think that was 9. Okay. And then if you want to do conspiracy theories, you can do the thumbs up. So not everybody voted, but it seems like gender roles won. Well, now we're getting more votes. This whole voting through Canvas, Zoom, confusing. Because it's always like delay in terms of like the thumbs up.
Could we try a like type 1 or 2 into chat, and that way it would stay there?
I like Alex's idea. So we're gonna go with Alex's idea. So do 1. So write in 1 for gender roles, and if you want conspiracy theories, write number 2.
Let's do conspiracy theories about gender roles.
What conspiracy theories do we have about gender roles?
I don't know. I was just trying to pick a happy medium for everyone.
Because the only thing I can think about would be like the gender, like stereotypes, like the conspiracy theories in terms of like, but that just sounds really hard to research. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have so far 10 for gender roles, and then 7 for conspiracy theories. So gender roles has 1. So we'll talk about gender roles for our 4th paper and our final paper. Okay. So moving forward, I will start planning for that 4th paper. So expect a update to our schedule sometime next week so that you guys can know what the approximate schedule would be for the remaining weeks of class. And of course, figuring out like the articles that we're going to be reading for that assignment. But moving towards our discussion about specifically cancel culture for our 3rd unit, for homework over the weekend, you guys were reading Zach Beauchamp's The Free Speech Debate Isn't Really About Free Speech. So what did you guys think about that article? Like, what stood out to you guys? What is he presenting in terms of the connection to cancel culture? Thoughts, observations, criticisms? What stood out to you guys? What do you guys think?
The part when he's like kind of asking the questions towards the beginning, when he said what kinds of speech should be morally out of bounds, what sort of speakers should be excluded from major platforms. It's like it's the second to last paragraph on page 2.
Okay. Yes, the real debate here is not about the principle of
Kind of social sanctions.
but the much greater questions about how we draw boundaries. What kind of speech should be morally out of bounds? What sorts of speakers should be excluded from major platforms? When can giving a platform to one kind of person actually make it harder for other people to speak their minds freely? And what kinds of social sanctions, like public shaming or firing, are justified responses to violations of these social norms. So like what stood out to you guys about those questions? Because there are a lot of moral questions that we're going to get into.
Another was that, I want to say it was UCLA, that professor was fired. I think he read like a speech, but he was using the actual like slang, and the N-word was used, and a lot of people were kind of like, what? But and I think he ended up getting fired for it. And I know some people were saying like, well, he was reading the context of the speech, like that's, versus him just using it as a derogatory way.
So that's a really big debate in education, and that's actually come up in classes I've taught before. Because of course, when you're reading specific texts that use derogatory language or that are talking about issues, whether or not, like for instance, the N-word is usually the one that comes to mind the most frequently, whether or not it is permissible because you're reading it from a source and you're not using it in a derogatory way, or is it something that should never be spoken unless somebody of that community chooses to use it? So has that something, because that UCLA, I think you said UCLA, correct?
Yeah, I want to say UCLA.
That's a pretty common example in terms of it.
Because I think he mentions them in the article too.
I can't remember. But in education, through derogatory words, or if we think about if we think about education, like what instructors or teachers do outside of work, whether or not they can be punished for it. For instance, if we think about like the rise of social media, like now parents and kids, if we think about like K through 12, they're able to find their teachers on social media. And what if they find something inappropriate? Like, what is the moral obligation of the teacher? Are they supposed to kind of hide like their whole lives online just because of their careers? Or do they are still able to like still like tweet or share a Facebook post just because of freedom of speech? Yeah, but that's definitely really important in terms of this article. This is probably the paragraph that made me choose this article specifically, especially if we think about the idea of boundaries. So if education is a boundary versus in real life, like what are their differences in terms of how much we judge somebody or how much we kind of shame or criticize them, or whether we view like those actions or that rhetoric as bad in terms of that situation. Oh, yeah, page 4, third to last paragraph. Thank you. So let's go to that. So bringing up, yeah, so you said political science lecturer who repeatedly said the N-word while reading MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail aloud. So this is not an abnormal situation, especially with the rise of social media with education. And of course, the rise of activism. So what do you guys think about that in terms of that example? Like, do you feel that saying the N-word is permissible in an educational setting when you're reading it from a text? Or is it something that, because it's so easy to avoid, that morally the teacher should have avoided it just to be more conscientious of students?
I think reading it like in a classroom setting as an educational piece, like, to get the thoughts and ideas flowing,
Yeah.
I can maybe see it, being used in that context. But if, it was just like, oh, hey, this is something I recommend as, reading, like, it wasn't class coursework. It was, nothing to do with class. Like it was his own, kind of free time, personal opinion article, then I can, see that. But, I mean, it's hard to say, being obviously on the other end of the spectrum, because I personally just don't like the word period, whether you're from that culture or not. But that's just me. So.
Yeah, the word for me, like, I wouldn't be comfortable even reading it. So in my classes I've taught where the writing does have it, it's been very easy for me to just say N-word. So people know, and then I can avoid, because I feel like I do not have the right to use that language because of the history of that language.
And I think it's one of those things where he easily could have asked the students, hey, there's,
Mhm.
this word in there. Is it okay that I use it in the context of the reading, or, should I avoid it? And that's almost and I think people are afraid to ask that question, but I feel like a lot of, the free speech and stuff comes down to that, where people say it, but it's like, okay, is it okay if I say this? Like, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does, definitely. Anyone else thoughts about that? Have you guys ever been in that situation in classes, whether with this example or even other derogatory language that may be used? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I personally haven't encountered anything like that. Just I don't know, because I've never really had the opportunity to read anyone's paper or anything like that where I've had to use the word. If anything, just like with like friends or stuff like that. But it's just kind of been like where I say like a term like to myself, I guess, because I mean I'm Mexican, so I use like I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that like I guess it's permissible, or like it's okay for me to call myself like the B word, or like call myself like a Mexican, or like jokes like that. And I see like if I'm like around like my friends who aren't Mexican or something, they kind of like they don't feel like if like they should say it or not, or like if
Yeah.
it's okay. They just kind of get like a little awkward. But
Or
I'm just like, no, I'm playing around.
of like, how would you feel if your friend were to use that word in a joke towards you?
I mean, if it like with a friend that I know, like obviously like I know he wouldn't be saying it in a way of like coming from negativity, or like being mad, or like saying it to actually hurt me.
Yeah. So it really depends on the relationship with the person, the context. But that's
Yeah, the context of which like it's said, I think it's like something that you should really consider too.
so that really connects this example because the context is it's an educational context. But right, while it's the context in terms of reading it, it's also creating a safe space for students. So that's where that debate really comes in. Um, so Dan, you mentioned like you were called a certain term and it was weird for you. I don't think I've ever heard somebody be called that.
No? So I think it was towards the end of my like high school. I don't want to say it was like senior year. Me and my buddy were walking to class, and this girl was walking by, and my buddy accidentally kind of bumped into her. Not meaning to. Like, it was just a narrow passage. She turned around and she said, "Watch where the f you're walking, crackers." And we're like,
Mm-hmm.
"What?" Like, that was the first time we'd heard it, so we're like, "What?" And then she just kind of kept walking. We're like, "All right, that was kind of like random." And our dean of discipline was actually African American, super cool dude, like super nice. And so he like had kind of brought it up to him. We're just like, hey, like, have you ever heard anybody called a cracker? And his face just kind of was like, what? And he's just like, who called you that? And we're like, oh, we're passing the student in the hallway. My buddy accidentally bumped her. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and he's just like, okay, and he was explaining that was a term used to be used for some of the slave drivers, from the crack of the whip. And so we're just like, oh, like we didn't know what to do with that. Like, you know what I mean? We're 18. Like,
Yeah.
my school was pretty diverse. We had a good mix of everybody. So we were just like, what? And then it seemed like in the years coming, like it just became like a term, or whatever, whatever cracker, like you're a cracker. And I was just like, what? Like, I never looked it up to see if it was true or not, but it was used in a derogatory sense. So I just never took it as a positive thing. Like,
Yeah. Well, especially it brings up the issue of like cultural awareness and also the history of terms, right? A lot of derogatory words that we don't even know the origins of. Unlike, well, we know the origins of the N word. However, if we think about like derogatory words for like Asians, right? A lot of them, we don't know necessarily the history of them. And once you learn, you really realize how bad they are in terms of dehumanizing individuals. Right. I know for me, like an example there was a girl I was in grad school with, and I remember on Instagram, she wrote a post and was referring to herself as like Chinky. And this is a white girl, and I got so upset, and I was like, how dare you basically mock and use that term that's been used to kind of, yeah, it was not okay, especially because she was like smiling really big and like doing the peace sign. It was just not okay. So of course, like things like that, yeah. So the history terms, and of course we can talk about like with cancel culture, informing people about them in order so that people are more aware in terms of why it's inappropriate to like, use that language, or even like the context in which, if we think of like Gustavo's example, right, his experience about like the context of like, well, if I know you and I know your intent, it's a very different thing. But if I don't know you well enough, then it's very inappropriate. So figuring out like the boundaries in terms of how we relate to other people. And you know, you probably have experienced some people are like way too comfortable with strangers in terms of oversharing, or thinking that they're immediately friends and able to joke around with them, even though that's not the case, especially when it comes to very serious things.
Yeah, there was I don't know if you've ever seen it, it was a while ago, but it's this video and it's like this white dude and he's hanging out with a bunch of his black friends and he's like doing stuff. He like gets them a drink, like buys them stuff, you know, and they're like, oh, like my N-word. And he's like, yo, like, and it shows them like slowly like kind of turning black, and like after 3 or 4 friends say it and he says something and this dude walks in and he's like, my N-word, and they all just turn around and like look at him, and like he immediately just goes back to white and he's like he's all embarrassed, like, oh, I guess I still can't say it, kind of a thing, like,
Yeah.
you know, but it's just kind of like highlighting, you know, the context of that word, you know, and it's just like, you maybe called it, but it doesn't make it okay to, you know, say it back. And I've had friends that are just like, hey, bro, like, if you want to say it, it's cool. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I know you're not using a derogatory, and I'm still like,
Mm-hmm.
nope, don't want to touch it. Like,
But we can think of like the moral obligation to inform people when they cross that line. So if we think about like stopping somebody instead of canceling them, figuring out what we can do to avoid that situation in the future, or they can know specifically of like why it's something that they shouldn't do. And of course, this wouldn't be necessarily a moral obligation for all scenarios, but when it's like something like that where they hear other people doing it and not realizing that there's a line, that just because others are doing it doesn't necessarily mean that they are allowed to. Anything else stand out to you guys in terms of this article? Any other thoughts or comments about it, or sections that really stood out to you guys?
I thought the I think it's the fourth paragraph of the second page where he's talking about how like there is freedom of speech, but like yet like people like neo-Nazis can't go on like news articles and like have their column, or like certain celebrities use their platforms and like someone censoring them, but there's no like federal law for it, kind of.
Yeah. So the abstract appeals to freedom of speech obscure the fact that what's being debated is not a right to one's speech, their right to air that speech in specific platforms without fear of social backlash. So neo-Nazis being that key example, right, who do not deserve a column in that paper. So if we think about like freedom of speech versus, right, the press, and of course the ability to censor, because of course if we think about like the legitimacy, like the big issue with why the New York Times like wouldn't give a platform to neo-Nazis is because it does fall under hate speech. And of course, if a big trustworthy corporation, or in this case newspaper, were to give them kind of that space, it legitimizes those ideas. So if we think about it, like censorship versus like hate speech, in order to like avoid not necessarily like that backlash, but avoid like legitimizing it, in that situation. Because of course, if we think about like people who are interested in that, in like those topics, they're going to find it online, but it doesn't mean that everyone, like a newspaper that millions of people read, would find it morally permissible to publish it. So that would be a really good example. What else stands out to you guys with that? Because I think for me, for this paragraph, is that emphasis on like liberal values and why Beauchamp specifically put that into quotations along with free speech. Because that is an interesting rhetorical choice. What do you
It's
guys
almost like the liberals are the only ones who like see the value, and
Mhm.
I guess it kind of gives the idea that the liberals are the only ones that are trying to take away freedom of speech, or cancel people in a sense.
It's very like, it's politicizing it.
Yeah. And then now you're talking about the hate speech in that last paragraph. It even mentions, Canada criminalizes hate speech.
Mhm.
Germany bans Holocaust denial, and then the United States permits both. Like that last, kind of sentence area is just,
Yeah.
America is a free society, while other two have somehow collapsed into,
Mhm. And of course, if you think about it, right, this is like the real problem with cancel culture in terms of like why people are being canceled is because legally people can use hate speech, right? They can present, if you think about Holocaust deniers, they can present those conspiracy theories without any legal repercussions, right? Or legal damages. So if you think about like cancel culture, that is a really big connection here in terms of creating a societal boundary when the government does it, right? Creating that boundary when derogatory words are used. So calling attention to it and having there be consequences, even though legally there wouldn't be any consequences. So if we think about, I always think about the guy in, I think it was New York, who, if we think about like all of the different viral videos about people spewing really racist things, and the assumption about immigration because people are speaking Spanish, even though, as we talked about within our first unit, we don't have, English is not our national language. We do not have an official language. So if we think about that as like hate speech, that's discrimination. And the reason people do it is because they can also get away with it. So the moral, like if we think about it, it's people taking like a moral stance against. If we think about that example, racist rhetoric, or the different crimes versus different crimes that people commit. So cancel culture, not necessarily, if we think of the video we watched last Wednesday, being centered on like the justice system. But if the justice system doesn't have laws against these things, it's society that has to fill in for it.
yeah. Well, like I think about those videos, like the Karen videos,
Mhm.
the one in New York where the lady, like the guy was bird watching,
Yeah.
and she like called the cops and was like, "Oh, I'm being attacked, like I'm being harassed." And the guy was literally just chilling on the bench, and she's like, choking out her dog. She lost her job, and it's like, you basically took a racist stance, because just an innocent, and it didn't even have to be a black man. As soon as she said there's a black man, that's like when it took the turn.
Her accusing him of attacking her,
Yeah,
really calling it like using a lot of racist stereotypes, especially if you think of like the history of like the discrimination against men of color in New York City specifically. I always think of like the Central Park Five, right? So that would be that situation. Or even if we think about like what could have been even more deadly, probably like one of the most tragic examples from US history being Emmett Till, right? Who was accused of hitting on a white woman. So, of course, if we think about like if that had happened just a few decades ago, like his life could have been just taken from him for a simple accusation. Oh, interesting. I'll have to look into that, Virginia. San Francisco, a Caring Act regarding 911 calls on minorities. I think I've heard that vaguely. I feel like that it should be something that should definitely be passed in terms of making sure that there are consequences, because I know there is a huge issue in terms of people calling 911 for like just complaining about people of color and trying to get them in trouble when they're not doing anything. There was
Like
also that
already
example.
barbecues.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking about. The barbecue example. There's been a lot of them within recent years.
Yeah.
I feel like there's not going to be a child named Karen ever again. I can't imagine, because it's taken on, it's a whole new term now.
Yeah. So, but yeah, you see these videos where like kids are literally in the street playing basketball or like selling lemonade on the corner, and like these people are so upset about it. And it's like, for
I think
what?
it was
They're
in
being
Francisco.
kids.
There was a little girl selling water, like bottles of water, and so a lady called the police on her. So
Yep.
it's like on children, and of course, um, just kind of, yeah, it boggles the
So they're
mind.
looking into basically finding those people now. Like if they call them and it's not a crime, like then basically they're going to be charged. I think it's like a fine for so many things, and then it's like if it escalates to a certain level, like it's going to be considered like a misdemeanor crime, basically. Like, and it should be, because that's ridiculous. Like,
Well, so especially because you're taking up the time for, like, that's the emergency line. But if you're calling in a complaint to somebody, that's not an emergency. And that's why they lie about being in danger if we think about the New York one. Um, so it's kind of escalating that, and then if, having to have consequences. So if we think about cancel culture, if we think about the businesses taking a moral stance, so that is like why people have been losing their jobs, because they're saying, well, we don't support these actions. So we can see in terms of and debates specifically on whether or not businesses have like the right, or if that falls under their moral obligation to disassociate, or even if that's just a PR move, if we think about it. I honestly have no idea how internet sleuths are able to track down all of these Karens and find out where they work and all of their details. It's a little scary how fast the internet works in terms of locating people.
I think that's why like the second to last paragraph is probably like one of my favorite ones.
Mm-hmm.
Navigating this type of change is difficult. People and institutions are going to make mistakes, even when acting with the best of intentions. Journalists and academics will be cruelly mobbed on social media and fired for bad reasons.
Yeah, and if we think about like making mistakes, we can think of some examples that we've already talked about in terms of people canceled celebrities and then finding out that they canceled them wrong, like the Johnny Depp example. So figuring out like how can we avoid these mistakes, right? So that people aren't shamed incorrectly and that we're not judging too early, especially in situations like that, right? Because of course, if we think about the issue with cancel culture, when it's the like he said, she said situation, it's a lot harder to dictate like who is in the wrong versus like the viral Karen videos where you see somebody's actions, right? So where do we draw that line in terms of our judgment, especially if we think about what specifically was presented in the last article in terms of like doing your research, right? and making your own point, especially if we think of the videos we watch that are emphasizing that and the relativity of these different issues. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this article or any other observations? So moving forward, right? As we're getting into like the moral debate surrounding cancel culture, and when we're thinking about the different ideas that Beauchamp and Bromwich presents, it's really interesting if we can figure out like what are the lines that we draw between the different actions. Because if we think about cancel culture, from the videos, the articles that we've read, there are some instances where either silencing somebody or calling attention to the misdeed is good, but then we have other situations where it's kind of unfair to the person or it goes too far. So if you think about it, right, we're going to classify the different reasons that people are canceled in terms of the highest on the pyramid being like the worst offense, the worst actions, versus the lowest being kind of the little things that people have been canceled for that are maybe not worthy of shaming, but worthy of kind of being informed about why people are upset about them. So if we think about it, like what are the different actions or offenses that really come up in cancel culture, especially if we think about like the worst versus the most kind of the most not necessarily innocence, not the good word, but the most maybe unintentional.
A recent one I could think of that's kind of towards like the bottom of the spectrum. I want to say it was last Monday Night Football game with Troy Aikman and Joe Buckman, I believe it was. They were talking about the flyover, and they were kind of saying, I guess it was like considered a hot mic, but they were saying it kind of seemed like a waste, there's not really any fans there, so people took it as okay, so now the military, doesn't deserve to do flyovers, like, almost like a slight insult against the military. So people were like, oh, screw them, like they don't give a crap, like they're washed up, whatever. But then, it kind of came into turns, and they were sort of explaining their side of the story, saying like, and there's so much to it, like there's flight hours that are required, all sorts of different things, but it wasn't considered. It was just okay, they're attacking the military now, so, they don't need to be broadcasters anymore, kind of a thing.
Yeah, so if you think about like when we interpret someone's words and we see it as an attack or we see it as bad, so if we think about it, like these may be unintentional. If we think about like bias or like what their real true meaning, the subtext of it. So if we think about it, like if we think about just misunderstandings in life, right? Having a conversation about it versus kind of wanting to cancel them outright. Especially if we think of situations where someone might say something and it might come across as insulting, but that's not necessarily what they meant. So if we think about it, like what other actions can we classify? Like what other things, especially if we think about like the different tiers, like the different levels. Like what comes to mind when we think about cancel culture and like the reasons why we cancel people? Especially if we think about all of the different examples that have come to mind.
I think one of the big no-nos right now is to speak out against the LGBTQ community. The second you try to invalidate them, basically just being a human being, you're automatically, it's kind of like, okay, well, even if you're kind of against that community, I feel like most people now are just like, okay, well, they're just trying to be, live and, have a life, like, so some people still support him, but I feel majority people, whether they say it out loud or not, are like, that's a no-go.
I would say there's a lot of different levels with that in terms of disrespecting LGBTQ identity, especially if we think about like one thing that would come to mind would like unintentionally using the wrong pronouns. Or if we think about like dead names for people who are trans or non-binary, then that's something that will maybe be like, if it's unintentional, like you're not meaning to offend that person. So if anything, like it could be informing them about why. But where, if you're doing that intentionally, if you're intentionally using the wrong pronouns or you're intentionally using someone's dead name, like what tier would that be in?
I would say tier 1.
Tier 1?
If you know it's offensive and you're still using it, like you're at the top.
Yeah, so purposely. I cannot.
Like it kind of goes back to like what Gustavo was saying. Like if he doesn't know the person, and they come at him, like, depending upon how they use it, he might look at it as okay, I don't know you, like, where are you coming from? Or, they just could be a complete stranger and just come blasting all those, negative stereotype words that people have heard.
So purposely wrong names or pronouns for people. So you're meaning to offend them, meaning to disregard their identities. So of course, what you're doing is wrong, which would be that big differentiation. What other situations, especially if you think about LGBTQ, right? That would just be like pronouns, dead names, that would be for trans, non-binary, or even agender. But like, if we think about it, it could be very different if we think about situations for LGBTQ based on sexuality and not gender. So we have like different offenses. If we think about specifically, like any other that come to mind, especially if we think about the examples of, I think it was the wedding cake place that was refusing to make a cake for a gay couple. So in terms of them citing their religious freedom, so like where would that fall in here?
I think that would be like a tier 2 maybe, because they're not necessarily like going out of their way to make derogatory terms, but they're not also, giving them, the opportunity to just be a couple getting married. Like, they're looking at it as, okay, oh, you're getting married? Oh, but you're 2 guys? Like,
Yeah. So you think tier 2, what about the rest of you guys? So discriminating, so not making that wedding cake, or if we think of that county clerk, I always forget her name, but refusing to grant wedding licenses for LGBTQ couples. So would that be tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3? Or I would say it's definitely not tier 4. I would argue that I'm kind of torn between what Dan said in terms of tier 2 and then putting it in tier 1. I don't know how much of that is just my personal feelings about those people, because it's hard to make that assessment, because like, where does our bias come in? Any ideas or thoughts about that? No, we're gonna go with Dan. You make the decisions. So discrimination.
Yeah, James brought up Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, so that's a really good example in Chick-fil-A. So in terms of like Chick-fil-A, like where would that fall here? Because of course, it's not necessarily like the employees, right? It's that people want to ban or cancel Chick-fil-A. It's centered around where the owner donates his money to anti-LGBTQ causes. So like, where would that fall here?
What did he do again? It was
The
Founder.
owner supports anti-LGBTQ causes. So we could even say just like being anti-LGBTQ,
Right.
but where does that
And it
fall?
seems like it's kind of on that religious level, I believe,
I
right?
know it's the same
kind
thing
of
in terms of people wanting to cancel Coachella because I think the person who runs it or who like owns it, I don't know if somebody owns it. They also are supporting like anti-LGBTQ causes.
I don't know. I think it's weird when I don't know if it's people's like personal opinions, like that's legit how they feel, like they don't care and they're using religion to cover it up, or, they just have that strong, religious belief and that's, really where they feel,
Yeah.
because I've seen it go both ways. I've seen people are like, I'm okay with it, but as a religious person, like, my religion kind of disputes it. So I feel like that's where it makes it weird between tier 1 and tier 2 type material.
Mhm.
But if you're actively going out of your way to support like anti stuff, then I would say that's tier 2. Like if you support a group, and they're just kind of like, well, we don't support them, but we're not against them. But
So like supporting any anti-group, so anything that's going against social justice.
yeah, because you're not like helping them, but you're supporting groups that aren't helping them. So it's,
And that's typically like supporting them with money.
yeah.
So I think like the examples, so like the owner of Chick-fil-A, but then of course, like if we think of like a local owner, if it's like somebody who just owns that one chain, if they're against it, like where do we draw the line? That's where it gets really complicated.
Yeah, and that's why I said, because like they're closed on Sundays, obviously, for like religious reasons. So that's why I said, like, it's almost like, okay, is he looking at the religion side or is he personally feel, and I feel like that's where it gets tricky too, because I
And
feel
then
like you could have a personal side and a religious side, but it's,
that might also be like why In-N-Out's not canceled. Because In-N-Out is also like very religious. They
yeah,
have I don't remember what it is at the bottom of the cups.
yeah, they have like the like Bible passages like Psalms and stuff like that, and
So it's not about being religious, it's about like like what organizations you support with your money that are going against people and their rights.
yeah, and then Starbucks flip flops a lot on a lot of stuff. They like take a stance and then it's like, okay, well screw you, like we're not going to support you, and they're like, nah, it's cool,
Yeah.
we're
Like,
sorry,
yeah,
like they change their minds real quick.
one of them was the issue with Starbucks like holiday cups. And then people got really mad when they made them non-denominational and they just made them red. So it's kind of like, can't win.
Yeah, and then same thing, they weren't allowing their associates to wear like BLM stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then like basically one person, I think somebody else had something on that might have been like religious or something, and they're like, okay, so they can wear this, but and then they're just like, okay, it's cool, like we support the movement, like you can wear what you want basically. So
Yeah. Where would we put like anti-Black Lives Matter people? Like, would that be on this list?
I would say it is, but I feel like it depends on the stance they take against it. I don't know, like, because you have those people who are like, oh, all lives matter, not just this. But then you get some people like, okay, well, why is your life any better than mine? Like you're just another, N-word or whatever the case may be. Like
Mhm.
some people are like, oh, let's incorporate everybody. Like we want everyone to feel like they matter. But then you have those people that are just like, nope, they're racist, they're rude, they're.
So if we can like differentiate it, so there's like the All Lives Matter, then there's like Blue Lives Matter, and then of course we get like the white supremacists, I would say. It's like James is very right, there is a spectrum. Like I would say white supremacists, I'm hoping no one disagrees, but we're gonna put that in white, like tier 1. I'm glad.
They're their own separate tier. They're above tier 1. They're the ones building the pyramid of racism.
So like white supremacists, anyone who supports white supremacists. So I would say, like, if you are in government and you get funding from white supremacists, then you are in tier 1. But then, of course, we get into all lives matter. I think we could argue that would be tier 4 because it's not inherently supposed to be offensive. I feel it's just people not knowing any better and not wanting to inform
They're
themselves.
not woke. Because I feel like that's a lot of the older people right now, like my grandparents' age. Like a lot of them are like, but everyone matters. And that's like, that's not the point, but you know.
Because we could inform them, right?
Yeah.
And they could change. And then if we think of like Blue Lives Matter,
Yeah. I feel like that's almost tier 3, tier 4 material as well. You know, because they're not saying, you know, like, I don't know, how do I want to put this? You know what I mean? Because they're the ones out there protecting us. You know, we don't know what they go through on a daily basis. You know, and so many people were out there just ready to kill cops, you know, condemn them, whatever the case may be. You know, and it's like, you know, that subject where you could literally build somebody a house, buy them a car, you know, do this, pay their rent, you know, but then they're like, oh, hey, you know, can you pick me up from the airport this, you know, this one time? Like, and you forget to pick them up from the airport. And they're just like, I can't count on you to do anything. You're the worst person in the world. You know, they focus on that one negative versus all the positives. And I feel like that's kind of how it is with the Blue Lives Matter. Like, you know, there's those few bad apples, but out of, you know, let's just say there's 90,000 cops, you know, but 10,000 are bad. Like,
yeah.
you know, everyone's focusing on that 10,000 versus the 80.
So just, yeah, so 3 because they're just not acknowledging those issues. So it could change. Because I would say, like, if we have like reform and there aren't as many issues and there's specifically not racial discrimination with the police force, that would be an agreeable statement. But because of it in being response to Black Lives Matter and disregarding the racial injustice, that's why it is an issue. Yeah, interesting. What other, so if we think of like the different examples we've talked about, so if we think about the Karens, like where do the Karens fall in here? If we think
Let's
about,
say tier 2, probably.
so like would we could even spectrum, so rate them. So if we say the 911 call Karen versus just the racist Karen, would they both be tier 2?
I feel like the racist ones, like they use the terms, should be tier 1. Like the 911, you know, she was speculating on the color of his skin. She didn't necessarily go into like derogatory terms, you know, like, oh, there's an N-word in the park. Like, you know, she used the color of his skin to agitate the, you know, the point of the call, where the other ones are, you know, like going out of their way to use derogatory terms. Like, as soon as you use a derogatory term like that, you're automatically tier 1 in my eyes.
Okay. Because you're immediately going against and dehumanizing a group of people. So like racist Karen. Not gonna lie, be really curious if there was a Karen in this classroom. And we can see like how a Karen feels about being called a Karen. It'd be interesting. What about 911 calling Karen? 911 call, who's not necessarily saying anything racist, but it's kind of just being, it's really hard because I just want to say being a Karen, but that really defeats the purpose. But being like entitled, if we think about it. So Dan says tier 2. What do the rest of you guys think? Where would you guys put 911 Karen? Do you guys agree tier 2? I don't know, I put that around it. So what other examples would come to mind. So if we think about the offenses, actions, if we think about celebrities, so where would the R. Kelly, where would Kanye fit in here? The LA Clippers owner. I'm not familiar with the LA Clippers owner. Do you mind like explaining a little bit, James? I'm not big on sports. For instance, Dan mentioned there was a game on Monday, and at this point I could not tell you what sport it was because I don't even know what sport seasons are. It's the record of making racist remarks. Yeah, so what do we do in terms of owners of teams or owners of games, like when they say racist remarks? Why aren't they canceled the same way like Chick-fil-A is canceled? So where would you feel like the LA Clippers owner would be, James? Would that be tier 1, 2, 3, or 4? Or what other examples come to mind? One or two? So just for the sake of space, since there's more room in tier 2, we're going to put it there. What other example? What about when a celebrity is accused of a sexual assault or sexual harassment? Where would that fall? Or even if we think about like Jussie Smollett that's mentioned, like what are those, where would he present those different issues? One if proved. So if we think about, which I'm running out of room, I'm running out of space. So proven sexual assault or harassment. But what if it hasn't been proven by like a court, but there are a lot of allegations? Like, is that something like, where would that go in here?
I think it depends on like I guess what the allegation is. Like if it's words, I
Mhm.
can maybe see like tier 3 until it's like proven like he was constantly saying, sexual or demeaning things. But if it's like physical, I would say tier 2 until proven.
So if like a celebrity were to say something that was really sexist in an interview, then that would be tier 3.
Yeah.
If it's proven and there's actually like a history or somebody, what if it's like an accuser? So not somebody saying a sexist, but someone's accusing them. Would that not go in here yet? Because of course, if we think of like the Me Too movement, there were a lot of actors who were accused. So even though there wasn't any prosecution.
Yeah. I would say it could like possibly go in tier 4, like, because then it's like, okay, if there is an accusation, then it can kind of, like, I feel like in tier 4, it brings things to light. In there, you're kind of able to navigate and talk about maybe what some of the things were said or, if they were wrongly accused.
So like need to talk about it or needs to be investigated to figure out like, well, what situation led to them being accused of this?
Yeah, because then it's one of those things where you could be like, oh, we were wrong. Like, because I feel like in tier 4, it can kind of fall off, like, okay, we were wrong. Like we said, like the Johnny Depp thing. He was accused, but we're like, we took the woman's side because of, kind of what's going on in the world. And we're like, okay, he's kind of a dick. But then we're like, oh,
I think
it wasn't him.
that comes to mind for that is also like the Aziz Ansari example, because he was accused, but he had a different impression of the event. It's like figuring out and talking about in terms of like why a woman had a problem with his actions. What else? Any other? We don't have a lot in tier 3.
I don't know if it's necessarily a thing, like, I don't know if people are bothered by it, but it was kind of upsetting when Joe Biden said, like, if you vote for Trump or like, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. You know, so it's, to me, that's kind of on that level too, because it's like, okay, now you're telling people they're not something because of the way they think or the way they feel. Like, you know, you're demeaning somebody into a position where they're going to conform to what you want. Otherwise, they're not, you know, really that, you know, society. Like,
So making generalizations about groups of people. So it's showing that they're not informed and that they need to be informed, but it's also in terms of it's not society's job to inform you, that you can't make a blanket statement about a large group of people. So James says bullying. So in terms of like, where would bullying fall under here? Because that's a tough one.
I feel like that's like another like spectrum kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Because it can go all the way from like, oh, you look ugly with your glasses to like, I'm gonna beat you senseless, you know, because you're black and you live, you know, in my neighborhood. Like,
And also like online bullying. So it can be, or psychological bullying. Ellen DeGeneres is also, it's really interesting to see kind of the fall of Ellen DeGeneres.
yeah.
Especially
I don't know if you heard like after Epstein's girlfriend was arrested, like there was talks about some of the celebrities that were involved, and supposedly she was like one of them tied in some weird way and something else, and yeah, that was the whole thing. But it makes me wonder how many, you know, Hollywood people are actually, you know, kind of involved with that, especially the ones that are like in that top echelon where like, you know, they're set for life, like nothing's gonna, you know.
yeah, it is really terrifying, and there's like a lot of conspiracy theories about it that could be true or could just be conspiracies. It's really hard to say, because of course with power comes a lot of well, money comes a lot of power and a lot of ability to kind of hide crimes, especially if we think of Jeffrey Epstein being able to get away with it for so long, when even when he was convicted, he was still not in prison and was still able to continue his actions. Or even like the Prince Andrew situation in terms of that. Yeah, it's really tough. And if we think of, yeah, it also makes me think of the NXIVM cults, because it's the same thing with like the Ghislaine Maxwell situation with Allison Mack in NXIVM for, I don't remember his name, but you know, like the actress from Smallville. Did you guys remember that story? How she became like the second in command for sex cults, and they were abusing women and like turning them into slaves, and it was just creepy, super creepy.
She was getting that fat money check.
No idea, honestly. Yeah, so if we think about it, but where would, if we think of like Ellen DeGeneres, so if we think of like toxic people, like where would maybe toxic people go? Because I feel like that was the biggest thing with her for bullying, where it wasn't like, it was her actions that maybe they weren't like the traditional bullying in terms of threats, but it was just toxic in terms of like tone and
I feel like almost like kind of between 3 and 4, like not quite 3, but not quite, you know, it's kind of just that weird in between.
they put her there.
And I think just, and I think more because like it was a lot of people that came out. Like if it was like a few that were kind of like, okay, but it seemed like it was a good chunk of people that have known her for years too were like, yeah, she kind of
And a lot
said
of movies being
something.
like, there's a reason I haven't been on that show for years. And then if we think like bullying, like if we think of where would physical bullying go versus like online bullying? Because it is a spectrum, but bullying by itself is bad. But like, what is kind of, how would we
I
differentiate?
think online should go in tier 1
Mm-hmm.
because once you put it online, that's the whole world can see it now. It's not just a physical attribute where
Or it's like you're
you know
going
you go
out of
home
your
and you have a bruise, but yeah, now you have other cultures making fun of you too. Like you end up getting bullied by other bullies from other places. Like that's sad.
and
I
then
would say physical is probably tier 2 because you still know what you're doing is wrong. You're still physically aggressing the person. You're going out of your way to make that person feel small and belittled.
yeah. Okay. What other actions in terms of cancel culture? Like any other things that would come to mind in terms of where we could classify them? If we think about like lying, if we think of like the Jesse Smollett case where he was lying about something, so it's like lying, of course, is a spectrum with like white lies versus like the really serious ones. So like which ones would be like cancelable?
I feel like he would be in tier 2, maybe, possibly tier 1, because he used so many offensive things against like black culture to make it seem like it was a hate crime. And hate crimes pretty much are tier 1. Um, but yeah, I mean, he paid people to carry this out. Like,
Like tier 1, hate crime, hate speech, lying about a crime. Tier 2, right? What about like lying to get something or to guilt someone?
maybe 3.
Maybe 3.
I guess it depends on what you're. Yeah, see, it's like one of those things. Like, what are you lying about to get, though?
So maybe lying to take advantage of a situation.
Yeah.
Because we all lie, but not all lies are cancelable. Anything else? If we think about it, this different examples, if we think about like Amber Heard, would she go on here? Because she was technically lying about a situation. Because if we think about like, we have sexual, like proven sexual assault, harassment, accused, but what about those who maybe lie about accusations or falsely accuse?
I think that still kind of goes into like a tier 2. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think about there was a football player had a full ride to college, everything, right? Was accused of rape, and then I think it was like 10 years or something like that after it happened.
Yeah.
She was trying to get money, and she basically the lawyer, in a sense, got her to essentially confess that she was lying about it the whole time. It
Mm-hmm.
never happened. Um, so he was released, but he missed out on 10 years. I personally think you should be convicted for that. If you put somebody in prison on a wrong accusation, you should go to prison yourself. Like,
Well, if she testified, technically it should be perjury, and that can be prison time. Depends on
so
if you want to pursue it. But so false accusations against people. What about if we think of like situations? I was just thinking about it, but it flew from my mind. Any other ideas that come to mind for you? So the president calling neighboring small countries the S-hole countries. So if we think about yeah, so if we think about, I don't know if that would fall under like generalizations about groups of people, but it's also falls under like racist rhetoric in terms of when you're demeaning other countries. I don't know. That one's kind of speaking of the present, where would we put in anti-maskers? Or that example talked about Holocaust deniers, but we do have coronavirus deniers. So like, would they fall under here somewhere?
Maybe 3.
Just because it can lead to serious issues for other people?
Yeah, I mean, and mostly because there's, you know what I mean? There's proven evidence of these things, you know? So it's like you're trying to refuse all this evidence that's out there, but
Mhm.
it's there.
Yeah. Or if we classify them as ignorant. So that's another thing in terms of these groups, right? So now we have like what goes in them. It's really figuring out like what are the differences. So if we think about what James just presented with tier 4, if we think about what goes into tier 4, a lot of these are ignorance, actions, or and if we think about like what we can do, the reason like what we emphasized can be corrected, right? We can create change, and it's clear that like with more knowledge about different issues, the people and these actions could change, right? Especially in terms of informing them about why these issues or why these actions are bad. So, but if we think about tier 3, right, with Blue Lives Matter not acknowledging the issues, sexist remarks but not physical, generalizations about groups of people, toxic people, lying about to take advantage of situation, mass coronavirus deniers, like if we think about it, there's ignorance there, but it's kind of going into like willful ignorance, so more purposeful.
Yeah. It's almost like somebody brought it up to them and they're still just like, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if you've ever heard the term, like, you know, when they say, like, you know, when they call, I guess they'd call the slaves, you know, boy, like, you know, then have names like, hey, boy. Like, my buddy didn't know, you know, and, you know, his nephews are, they're mixed. Well, they're, you know, they're Hispanic and white, you know, but he, you know, he would say to his nephews, he's like, hey, boys, come on, like,
Mm-hmm.
and one day one of our black friends was like, do you not know that's like racist? And he was like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're boys. I don't, what? Like, you know, and he explained to him and he's just like, oh, like,
Yeah.
my bad. You know, like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I just refer to them as boys because they're boys. Like, you know, he didn't know. Like, you know, so I feel like that's that tier 4. If you're willing to learn, like, cool. But once you know and you're, you know, like you said, you're informed and you're kind of like willfully ignorant, then yeah, you're
Mm-hmm.
definitely
Like, you know what's the problem, and just be like, well, you're just overreacting. I'm gonna do it anyways, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was just like, well,
And then of course, like the biggest thing with the willful ignorance, like these actions, they can negatively affect others, right? If we think about others' feelings or others' like safety, which is why it's also in tier 3. If we think about these different situations, if we think about tier 2, like we have discrimination against LGBTQ, supporting anti-groups, so anti-social justice groups, whether it's like anti-women's rights, anti-racial rights, or any anti-LGBTQ through like money or even false accusations, the 911 Karen, the owner of LA Clippers with the racist remarks, but I think that one could have been 1 or 2, according to James. Physical bullying, lying about a crime. So like, how would we title that one? So if we think about the difference of like what makes these more severe than willful purposeful ignorance that affect others. Intensive harm and degrading, yeah. So degrading, intent to harm others. So if you think about, discrimination specifically supposed to degrade and go and show like other people are not equal to you. we think about supporting, it's you're helping other people harm groups. So I think that would be definitely a really good way of characterizing tier 2. What about tier 1? Because those were, of course, the worst. So we had proven sexual harassment or sexual assault. We have the racist Karen. We have the purposely wrong names and pronouns, white supremacists, online bullying, hate crimes, hate speech. Like what how would we like name that category?
Like anti-human rights, kind of.
So like dehumanizing
Yeah.
and harming.
Because you're not even making them feel, like less of a person. You're making them feel that they're not even human at that point. You're.
So dehumanizing and harming others.
That when we're talking about like tier 3, it kind of brings up the sense in the article that we're reading. It says, but on the whole, their work is aimed not at restricting freedom, but expanding it, making historically marginalized voices feel comfortable enough in the public square to be their authentic selves, to exist honestly and speak their own truths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you think of like that definitely connects to these things, like the reason they're being canceled is because it is harming others from feeling safe or feeling comfortable, or even actually like harming like who they are and how people treat them. Definitely. Anything else we'd add now that we've named the different categories? Or any thoughts or things we'd kind of assess with those? So it's interesting to see kind of, this is why if we think of the examples we talked about, if we think about the video we watched last Wednesday, there are different ways that we can react because of course not all actions have the same effect as we can see in terms of like the how much we can cancel somebody or how much somebody deserves to be canceled depending on a situation. So really in terms of building off of this, that's what we're going to assess, which we are shorter on time than I had planned with the classification. So would you guys prefer to just do this as our large group in terms of that discussion instead of doing short breakout sessions? I just see Dan nodding. See lots of yeses. Awesome. I still get a giggle every time I see Artie's pineapple belongs on pizza. I kind of hope you keep that title. So if we think about all of the different actions we've talked about, the different way we've classified them based on those tiers, it's really important to figure out, okay, what are the moral obligations for the individuals involved and for society, especially if we think about what it is that like the choices we make in terms of whether or not to cancel someone or the rate and like the severity of that cancellation, especially when we're trying to get into our moral theories specifically. I don't know what Dan's, that's your opinion, stick to your guns.
Oh, that's to Artie, yeah.
Okay, I was super confused. I was like, opinion about morality? True. In his heart. So in terms of like, for these different examples, for those different rates, like, how do we assess the moral obligation for us as individuals versus the people who commit these actions versus society to choose to cancel them, especially depending on the variety in terms of severity? So if we think about like tier 1, where people are outright dehumanizing or harming others, right? What is the moral obligation for us who witness it versus the people who are committing these actions versus everybody in our society? When we see the racist Karen or we hear a racist Karen, when we encounter white supremacy, or hear about white supremacy or hate crimes, hate speech, any of those things, like what are the moral obligations? Which, oops. I took a screen capture of it to have side by side. Let me open that briefly so we can reference it a little bit more easily. So here we go. So when you think about these different, so if we think about like the different groups that we've characterized, like what are our moral obligations? So if we're saying these are objectively wrong, when we're thinking about like the moral theory, like, is it our responsibility to do something or call this out as individuals or as a society?
Yes.
Why?
Because we live in that society too, you know, that's our future generations, that's, you know, our friends, our family that's being affected. Um, you know, so it's same thing. If you see somebody, you know, getting bullied, you shouldn't just stand there, you know, step in. Like, you don't have to beat the crud out of the person, but you know, you should take a moral stand. You know, everyone talks about their moral obligations and this, and they don't want to get involved, but if society doesn't get involved, then how many more of these people are going to continue on to be able to do this to more people?
Yeah.
You know, it's like if you have a rat problem, you're not just going to be like, well, they'll go away eventually. No, you set rat traps, right?
Mm-hmm. So we are morally obligated to say something as individuals. What about for degrading intent harm others? Like, what is the moral obligation there?
Same thing, you got to step in because otherwise they, you know, those can easily escalate into tier ones.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a moral obligation at all levels, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Because they, like I said, like even with tier two, like, you know, tier fours, you know, the tier threes, they're essentially tier fours, you know, at some point, you know, and maybe they learned and then they just, okay, well, that's your opinion, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it seems like the more, you know, like willingly ignorant you get, like the more willing you're to almost stand your ground, and you're going to say things that'll, you know, help your cause but not others.
Yeah. Interesting. Would anyone agree with that in terms of it? Especially James deciding as a consensus on of an appropriate action for such conduct. So we are morally obligated, but it's figuring out like what is the action that we're morally obligated to present. Like, where do we draw the line in our calling it out between, right, our moral obligation and then turning it into public shaming? So it's like we have the individual right to call it out. It's our moral obligation when we see it. But what about as cancel culture, as a society? Because I would agree with what Dan presented. We have a moral obligation for all four of these tiers. So it's the real question is when it's the individual versus when it's a societal moral obligation. Especially if we think about the viral videos we've seen, right? So we can see someone calling it out, but when do we go too far in calling it out? Like, what is the appropriate action, as James says? What do you guys think?
I think it's kind of the same thing with like the whole justice system. Like if you don't have all the facts, and you're just like, cancel this person immediately. They shouldn't exist. They shouldn't be allowed in society, and it turns out, okay, we were wrong. Or I think it depends. Now, if it's proven like tier 1 and tier 2 as an individual, if you want to go out and say, hey, these people shouldn't be allowed, they should be canceled, cool. But
So maybe for tier 1, we need to, as a society, instead of just calling it out, but society, we need to fight to make these things illegal so that there are repercussions.
yeah,
So that would be like the society's obligation versus our individual ones to call it out in that situation. So that tier 1 eventually is not happening at all. If we think about tier 2, if we think about our justice system, would that be similar in terms of making these things illegal? So I know we mentioned, like, if we think about Virginia's example in terms of the Karen law, making it illegal to call into 911 and falsely accuse people of color. So we would say that would maybe another one that would be focused on make things illegal. Or is that going too far? James does bring up a really good point. So there are definitely industries that protect some of the powerful people. So it does make it hard for us as individuals to call them out. Or even it can also be very dangerous as individuals to call them out. Because I know I'm probably not alone. I hate white supremacy. I hate white supremacists. But also, like, if I were to be in that situation where I'm the only person and there was like a group of white supremacists, I would be terrified. So it's like one person who does not necessarily have like the power or might be putting themselves in danger. And of course, free speech kind of allowing them, because it's not illegal to use hate speech in the United States. So maybe changing the law so that we can make that illegal. If we think about number 2, make things illegal in terms of actions, what about tier 3 and tier 4?
I think those can be on an individual level.
So I think tier 4, like especially individual in terms of conversation, but would you say it not necessarily needs to be like online? So if you see these actions, you don't necessarily like call them out on the internet and turn it into everybody a societal issue.
Yeah.
So in terms of like, don't post it online to avoid it from becoming like public shaming and talking it out with them. What about number 3? Because that's the more severe, so the willful ignorance. Because if it's willful, we can't necessarily have that conversation. So is that individual or is it?
I feel like it can be individual, but it's one of those, if you take the stance and they're still willfully, then you can expose it to, like in the military, we term to use, lowest level possible. Like you start out by speaking to that member, and if that member doesn't want to, straighten out, then you bring it to your supervisor. And if it needs to become a command issue, then the whole command steps in, and reprimands that person.
Yeah. So we can say like that person needs to change. So it's not us as individuals, it's them as individuals. If we think about it, like because we can't force the change, and of course, what they're doing may not be necessarily illegal. So it's not necessarily to the extent of making it illegal. So in terms of that case, in order to, is it our moral obligation to like call attention to their actions to help make them change or bring them to the awareness of change? Especially if you think of like the difference between like the videos.
Yeah, because to me, like, I feel like tier 3 and tier 4 is still kind of in that thoughts / opinions arena, where it's like, once you get to tier 2 and tier 1, like it's no longer thoughts and opinions to those people. It's facts, like
Yeah.
certain color of people are less than us. That's, their fact, and that's why they say those things.
Mhm.
Where thoughts and opinions, you might get them to, maybe sway a little bit, kind of back off, and they'll still have their, somewhat kind of hateful-ish opinions, but, it might not be as severe, or it might, open up, something they didn't think about. If that
What
makes
about, like, question for tier 3 in terms of breaking that down? So if it's that individual needs to change, it's not as severe as tier 1 or tier 2. Like, how can we get those individuals to change? Because they're the ones who have to do it themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. So James brings up like the complex, like it depends if it's a public business or individual, right? So if we think about it, right, that's the one that gets really difficult because it's a little bit more foggy in terms of with cancel culture is by making it public gonna help to inspire them to change or force them to change? Or will it do the opposite? Or is it just shaming them?
I think it just depends on the person too, because some people might be like, I'm just gonna kind of hide out
Yeah.
for a while, and that kind of seems to be the thing, like, oh, let me just duck out, and then somebody else blows up and they're like, cool, and they slip right back in. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's just like a each and every, you know what I mean? Because everybody, learns differently, same thing like when you're being punished as a kid, like you could be put in timeout 1,000 times and you're like, that's all I got to do. I got to sit in the corner for 5 minutes, but then like it escalates to like, now you're going to get a whooping and you're like, well, damn, I'm definitely not going to do that again.
Mm-hmm. So it definitely depends on the situation. So I would say, like, if we think about like the situation, whether or not we call it out online to post it, like one, I would say Ellen DeGeneres wouldn't have changed if people didn't call it out online. So maybe in that situation,
Yeah, because there's an image to uphold.
yeah. So maybe that is the fair choice. But when it comes to like a individual person lying to take advantage of a situation, since that is more specific, like that it's not fair to post online.
Yeah. And I think it depends on how you go about it online too, because you could attack that person online,
Yeah.
or you could just say, hey, I had a thought about, what somebody said, like, what do you guys think? When you open it up to like a conversation, then I think that person might be like, okay. But as soon as you feel attacked, you're going to be like, screw you. You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to bend to the will, if you're a strong-willed person. But, and that's the problem, is I think a lot of people use the online platform to attack them instead of trying to bring them into the conversation to say, hey, here's where we think, you can make some changes to be a better person, or, we thought your thought on this was a little rough. Get them involved. It's when you shame them and they're not involved,
Mm-hmm.
you're less willing to change.
Yeah. So maybe if we think about like this one, I like how you said bringing them into the conversation, because sometimes you need to make it public to get them to listen and bring them in. If we think about the Ellen DeGeneres example, where that allowed like the employees to kind of freely voice their issues and feel safe doing it. Or even if we think about like the Bon Appetit example, which are you guys, I don't think we've talked about that one. So Bon Appetit is, well, it's a food magazine, but it also is a very popular YouTube channel where the different chefs would do different videos, like making different things or doing different challenges. And a couple months ago, there was the controversy because the people of color who were in those videos, they came out together with a statement in terms of the issue of pay disparity, saying that they were paid or not paid for those videos while their white coworkers were paid for completing the videos. So they wanted equal pay for like equal work. So in terms of that, like they came out on the internet and posted about it in order to get the company to make those changes and getting the fans on the side. So in that way, like it's that protecting thing or even Amazon, definitely a good example, where by making it public as an employee, you're protecting yourself because now you can't be unfairly fired for or retaliated against without there being repercussions. So if you think about like the individual obligation to like support these people and create those change, or support them and say like it's great that you're saying and kind of coming out about these different issues. Yeah. Any, or even if we think about like getting them into a conversation, like figuring out in what context, like can we create like a middle ground to have open dialogue about these different issues, especially if we think about Blue Lives Matter, not acknowledging the issues of systemic racism in policing. So like figuring out like what situation can we create to have a conversation versus just shaming people. So if you think about it, like that's something that's a little bit more difficult in some situations. Any other thoughts or any other ideas in terms of this? But we've already agreed. So the first two, tier 1, tier 2, there is for sure an individual obligation. There's a societal obligation. Tier 3, tier 4, that's when it becomes more individual in terms of a case-by-case scenario. But anything else you would want to add? Or any other thoughts about this? So moving, so if you think about it, if we think about like the different examples that we've come to mind, what are like the public responses that don't necessarily fit into the classification that we've created? Like what examples and what tier did maybe as a society we've gone too far? Or even as a society, we didn't go far enough in terms of our reactions to these things. Any ideas? I would say there's a lot in terms of tier 4 where people have been accused and it hasn't been prosecuted, but instead of having a conversation about it, people were just canceled or shamed online. So maybe we, as a society, we need to be more mindful of the information before we make a choice, especially if we think about the Johnny Depp example. Instead of going into shaming, like that could have been a conversation, or we could have waited for his side before making that judgment. And I would say in terms of the issue of white supremacists, like online bullying, hate crimes, hate speech, like we as a society haven't gone far enough to stop those things yet. Yeah, so I would definitely agree with Dan. There is more overreaction versus underreaction. So it's kind of really figuring out like how we can respond properly as a society. Any other ideas or any other thoughts in terms of our assessing the responses for different examples?
Did you see James comment?
Oh, I did not. Thank you. So James said, I feel that people who were protesting, the kneeling kneeling, burning individual player jerseys went too far. Oh, do you mean Colin Kaepernick, that example? So I would say in that case, there was an overreaction. And in that case specifically, right, the organization canceled him, the NFL, because teams did not want to have him play. So he was incorrectly canceled by essentially his potential employers, even though now a lot of them are saying that they would happily hire him to be a quarterback on their team. So like that was definitely like an overreaction for people then. And then of course like burning jerseys, definitely. I know there's some other instances I feel like that's happened. Any others that come to mind? Or any other thoughts? If you think about like the moral responses. I'm not familiar. I've heard the name Michael Vick, but I don't know enough about him.
He was the one who had the whole dog fighting thing going on. He was raising dogs to do dog fights. And so he was convicted of it, basically did some jail time, some like community service.
Mm-hmm.
And people were like, oh, it's animal cruelty. Like, so people were like, that dude deserves nothing. He shouldn't be anywhere. Well, eventually, he made his way back into the NFL. A lot of people that were Michael Vick fans were just like, okay, well, he did his time. He did what he needed to do to reform. He's a better person. Like, he said he was sorry.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's almost like if people, I don't know, it's a weird thing. Like, they wanted to cancel him, but then after a while, they're just like, okay, well, he's sorry. Or it feels like with some people, like, nope, no matter amount of sorry, or how much you reform, they're just not allowed back.
Yeah, so the real question is like, at what point can we forgive people, or can we acknowledge change? Because that's a big part of cancel culture. Like, if somebody did their time, as a society, like, we're supposed to accept that. But in certain situations, like, can we? Or it's like, who makes that judgment call? And that actually brings up another one in terms of where an action that we didn't address, like animal cruelty or animal abuse, like I would put that tier 1. So of course, because it's tier 1, it is a crime. But like, how does, based on the tier, like how can we assess change? Right? Is if you were a white supremacist, but you've changed, you've learned, and you've done time for it, like, will society forgive you? Or is it possible to get forgiveness?
I think if people don't know, then I feel like it's easier to forgive them. Like, you know what I mean? But if you come out the gates and you're like, I was a white supremacist, but I've changed, people are like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
like they don't want to give you that chance because they already know what your background was.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? There's people that work, now people are like, wait, like you were in a gang, like you were a white supremacist. And they're like, but you're so different, and they're just like, well, you're a better person now. So it's almost like if you don't know, then I feel like you have a better chance of showing people you've changed and being judged less harshly and canceled less versus, that's who you were, that's who you're always going to be.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And then James brings, real in terms of animal cruelty. So like whipping a horse versus like spurs from cowboy boots. I'm also I've only been around a horse like very infrequently in my life. So I don't necessarily know like the reasoning behind spurs or whipping. I view it as animal cruelty, but I don't necessarily have enough background to be able to make that assessment fairly.
It's basically like a control tool on the animal.
Hmm.
using it to control them. So, it's almost kind of like hitting a kid, like when you're in public, are you going to keep acting up? Here's a little pop in the head. Like, it's subtle, but over time, eventually, it's going to leave a mark, or it's going to do, physical, mental damage. Like,
Yeah. So maybe it really comes down to the extent. So if you are not training them properly and it's just a consistent thing versus if it's just in certain situations or to train, I would say like maybe it might be more permissible, but like if you are purposely like hitting a horse outside of the context or any animal, like first of all, I don't know how you live with yourself because like I feel guilty if I accidentally like almost step on my cat when they're trying to trip me.
yeah.
You have
I
cats.
mean, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I don't like horse racing. I went to one event like when I was younger, and I just did not.
Mhm.
I personally almost take that as animal cruelty. You know what I mean? Like you're taking these horses and
Yeah, it's a big argument,
ostracizing them. Like,
especially in recent years with how many horses have died at the different racetracks recently. So if that's bringing into question like their treatment of like, did they die because the track was faulty or did they die because of a result of years of abuse? Especially in terms of with horses, if they break a leg, it seems as basically
it's
more,
career ending.
they're in more pain, like it's morally right to euthanize to put them out of pain because they can't necessarily heal from it. Which is why there's been a lot of investigations into even our local horse track. I also don't believe in dog racing because I don't know. It just doesn't seem like a good life for a dog.
Yeah, I mean, well, think about it. Especially if you don't win, like,
Mm-hmm.
you're just kind of okay. Well, here's a 3x3 cube of concrete and fence. Enjoy your life.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like once you win, then
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into that. And of course, animal cruelty, it also gets into in terms of drug trials, and that's when it gets a little tricky. If drug trials or any kind of trial is animal cruelty, or is it a necessity in terms of protecting human life? Because I feel like cosmetics should never be tested on animals, but it gets a lot more tricky when it comes to medications. I'm still like kind of iffy in terms of my moral feelings about animal testing for different medical treatments. Yeah, interesting. Any other thoughts or any other examples that come to mind in terms of this? Okay. So there's a lot that really goes into our moral questions, as we can see, as we're going to break them down. So moving forward, which let me clear this real fast. There we go. So in terms of this week, for our discussion about our next reading, so our assignment for Wednesday, it's not a reading, but there is a documentary. So the link is posted in our module. So you're going to watch the CBSN's documentary, Speaking Frankly, on cancel culture. And then we do have a discussion post about that documentary. So that is our last source. And that'll finish up our conversation about the different things that go into cancel culture. And then next Monday, we're going to get into drafting for the prompt for this paper, because after next week, well, our rough draft is going to be due later next week because the week after we do have a holiday on Wednesday. So it is a little funky in terms of our scheduling. I know I'm excited for a random Wednesday holiday. It's just, I don't know.
veterans need love.
Veterans do need love, but it's just like, I feel like if it's going to be on a Wednesday, just give us the rest of the week off.
I'm not arguing that.
I mean, but it just made it a little wonky in terms of conferencing scheduling. So that's why our schedule is like that in terms of for our next paper. But yes, this is the homework that's due on Wednesday before class. And then we all are all set for today. So have a great day. Enjoy the slightly cooler weather. It actually feels like fall. It's kind of a miracle here in San Diego. I got a little bit of rain on my car yesterday and I was weirded out. I also discovered I need new windshield wipers, but you know, that's always what happens here.
It's always an epidemic in California, windshield wipers.
I
We
know.
don't need them, and then it rains. Ah, crap, I need them.
Yeah, and it's kind of just like I don't know when to change them because it barely rains.
Change them after summer going into fall because the summer dries them out.
I mean, also I don't know how often you're supposed to replace them because my windshield wipers are definitely original to my car.
Once a year after summer.
I'm
Okay.
4 years overdue.